The Holy Gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ according to Mark.
Glory to you, Lord Christ.
Jesus set out and went away to the region of Tyre. He entered a house and did not want anyone to know he was there. Yet he could not escape notice. But a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit immediately heard about him. And she came and bowed down at his feet. Now the woman was a Gentile of Syrophoenician origin. She begged him to cast out the demon of her daughter. He said to her, "Let the children be fed first, for it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." But she answered him, "Sir, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." Then he said to her, "For saying that, you may go. The demon has left your daughter." So she went home, found the child lying on the bed, and the demon was gone. Then he returned from the region of Tyre and went by way of Sidon towards the Sea of Galilee in the region of the Decapolis. They brought to him a deaf man who had an impediment in his speech, and they begged him to lay his hand on him. He took the man aside in private, away from the crowd, and put his fingers into his ears and spat and touched his tongue. Then looking up to heaven, he sighed and said to him, "Ephphatha," that is, "be opened." And immediately his ears were opened and his tongue was released, and he spoke plainly. Then Jesus ordered them to tell no one. But the more he ordered them, the more zealously they proclaimed it. They were astounded beyond measure, saying, "He has done everything well. He makes the deaf to hear and the mute to speak." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Christ.
Please be seated. Now, I think if you were to make a Venn diagram of those who chose to attend St. Andrew's on this Sunday morning and those who are avid watchers of American reality TV, there would be a strong overlap, right? No, not so much. Okay. Well, let me fill you in on something I heard rumbling about the internet. There is a talent show called America's Got Talent. You might have heard of that. And recently on there was a contestant who goes by the name Nightbird. Her real name is Jane Marzuski. And this young woman in her early 30s got up there before the judges and sang one of the most beautiful original songs that I've heard someone sing in such a setting. But more so, what struck me was what followed after. You see, Jane shared how she was living with a cancer diagnosis. And what caught my attention especially was a blog that she writes on. And I want to share with you a little bit of what she wrote in a recent post. Now, I need to add a little asterisk to what I'm about to read. Jane feels most comfortable ascribing male pronouns to God. And I trust that we can still hear her words, even if that makes us uncomfortable. So here is what she writes. "I have had cancer 3 times now, and I've barely passed 30. There are times when I wonder what I must have done to deserve such a story. I fear sometimes that when I die and meet with God, that he will say I disappointed him, or offended him, or failed him. Maybe he'll say I just never learned the lesson, or that I wasn't grateful enough. But one thing I know for sure is this: he can never say that he did not know me. I am God's downstairs neighbor, banging on the ceiling with a broomstick. I show up at his door every day, sometimes with songs, sometimes with curses, sometimes apologies, gifts, questions, demands. Sometimes I use my key under the doormat to let myself in. Other times I sulk outside until he opens the door to me himself. I have called him a cheat and a liar, and I meant it. I've told him I wanted to die, and I meant it. Tears have become the only prayer I know. When I read Jane's post, I couldn't help but think of the story we just heard of what we now know as the Syrophoenician woman. It's a story like Jane's of a woman who demands God's attention, a desperate woman who longs for healing of her child. But then in both of these stories, there's Jesus, right? Jesus, who says it's not fair to take the children's food and feed it to the dogs. I don't know about you, I find it hard to square this Jesus away with the gentle image of Jesus that so many of us hold. This Jesus' gentleness has suddenly turned rigid. This Jesus' holiness has seemingly turned into a holier-than-thou personality. And over the course of years, scholars and preachers alike have contorted themselves, the text, and even Jesus to try to make sense of how we reconcile his action here and the Jesus that we cling to. Some say that he is giving voice to what's going on in the disciples' heads. You see, this woman was a Gentile woman, that is to say, an outsider, and they are in an outside land. So they encounter a strange woman in a strange land who nonetheless, the strange land and its people were a source of oppression for the people of Israel. And you throw on top of that, she is a woman. So perhaps he's giving voice to what the disciples were thinking. Others say that perhaps he was testing the woman, that he was giving her an opportunity to demonstrate her faith before the crowd that had assembled around. And still others try to play with the actual language itself and say, well, if you look at the Greek, Jesus didn't actually mean dog. You see, it means puppy dog, right? And we all know puppy dogs are cute and playful. So maybe just Jesus is talking about a puppy dog, and that makes it okay. Frankly, I see some head shaking. Frankly, none of those answers sit well with me either. Which then leaves us with the disturbing thought, what if Jesus actually meant what he said in this text? Could it be that Jesus, like us, lived in a world where some lives were valued above others? Could it be that Jesus was a product carried, like us, unknown biases that impacted his interactions with others? Could it be that Jesus, like us, was actually human? That God indeed put on flesh and dwelt among us? Perhaps this story reveals more of the scandal of the incarnation than that familiar story we find that begins in a manger. God, fully human. And still, one of the miracles of being human is the ability to grow, the ability to change, the ability to learn. Perhaps that is what we see in this story. Jesus being opened up by this woman. Jesus learning, being nudged into a deeper, more broad, more inclusive vision of God's mission in this world that defies so many of our human tendencies. God being human. God learning. Now, some of you might know that we have a prayer in our Book of Common Prayer that reflects some of the language that the Syrophoenician woman uses. It's called the Prayer of Humble Access. It's a prayer that is sometimes said before one comes forward to receive communion. And it goes like this. We do not presume to come to this thy table, O Lord, trusting in our own righteousness, but trusting in your manifold and great mercies. We are not worthy so much as to gather up the crumbs from under thy table. But thou art the same, Lord, whose property is to always have mercy. You are the same, Lord, whose property it is to always have mercy. I think that despite the fact of being a complete outsider, this woman knew something about the God whose property it is to always show mercy. She saw that God in Jesus, that person who was both fully human and fully divine. So perhaps we, like Jesus, have something to learn from this noisy downstairs neighbor. For it is in demanding God to be who God promises to be, that is to say, by faith, that not only Jesus, but the woman herself is opened up. We heard about how her daughter is healed, but the story continues after that. You see, Jesus moves on, continues his ministry in the Gentile lands. He reaches out and heals the man who cannot speak. He loosens his tongue. And the word for healing is the same word for salvation. But then the story continues even beyond that. What happens immediately thereafter is the lesser known miracle of the feeding of the 4,000. You might recall we spent 5 weeks talking about the feeding of the 5,000. This is the feeding of the 4,000. The feeding that happens in the outside land, in the Gentile territory. The feeding where the bread of life is given to those traditionally on the outside of God's kingdom. It is the story of God's healing mission in the world being extended and moving out into all of creation. And this pivot in Mark's gospel, all of it begins with this woman who possesses the audacity to demand that God be who God claims to be. Stubborn faith opens the whole thing up. So yes, we, like Jesus, have something to learn from this woman. Perhaps we might listen a little more closely to her and to her sister, that being Jane, whose article I read earlier this morning. I want to share with you a few words from her still that I think guide us in this way of stubborn faith. She continues writing, saying, "Tears have become the only prayer I know. Prayer rolls over my nostrils and drips down my forearms. Prayer falls to the ground as I reach for God. These are the prayers I repeat night and day, sunrise, sunset. Call me bitter if you want to. That's fair. Call me among the angry, the cynical, the offended, the hardened. But also count me among the friends of God. For I have seen him in rare form. I have felt his exhale. I have laid in his shadow, squinted to read the messages written for me in the grout that say, I'm sad too. If an explanation would help, he would write me one. I know it. But maybe an explanation would only start an argument between us, and I don't want to argue with God. I want to lay in a hammock with him and trace the veins in his arms. I remind myself that I'm praying to the God who let the Israelites stay lost for decades. They begged him to arrive in the promised land, but instead he let them wander, answering the prayers they did not pray. For 40 years, their shoes never wore out. Fire lit their path each night. Every morning, he sent them mercy bread from heaven. I see mercy in the dusty sunlight that outlines the trees, in my mother's crooked hands, in the blanket my friends have left for me, in the harmony of the wind chimes. It's not the mercy that I asked for, but it is mercy nonetheless. And I learn a new prayer. Thank you. It's a prayer I don't mean yet, but will repeat until I do. Call me cursed, call me lost, call me scorned, but that's not all. Call me chosen, blessed, sought after. Call me the one who God whispers his secrets to. I am the one whose belly is filled with loaves of mercy that were hidden for me. Amen.